So in this video, we're going to talk a little bit more about what the Christian Standard Bible is. So what is the translation philosophy, what are the distinctives about it, and how can it serve your church? So Trevin, the first thing is the CSB is a translation from the original languages, over 100 scholars from 17 different denominations and non-denominations. So it's a very broad group of people that were behind it. And then of course we had the Translation Oversight Committee recently, which was another group of diverse scholars. So you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, what brought all these translators together, the original translation team and now the Translation Oversight Committee, was this idea of optimal equivalence. That's the philosophical word that explains the heartbeat behind the kind of translation they were trying to do. So to explain that a little bit, optimal equivalence simply means, you know how when you think of Bible translations, you know how there's a spectrum? Mm-hmm. There's a word for word equivalence that's literal, there are different translations that fall on the spectrum, but there's some that lean more that way, right. More word for word, more literal. And then you have translations that are more dynamic. Dynamic equivalence is the name of it, more thought for thought. When the translation team for the CSB came together and the Translation Oversight Committee was working, they were asking the question, how can we be the best of both of those things? How can we be optimal equivalent? Meaning, how can we do a word for word, what is it essentially, a word for word translation where we are never going to compromise accuracy,
right.
But then also be highly readable. So if you see the CSB logo with the compass point, with the arrow pointing to true north, there's a symbolism there. The significance of that is to say, where accuracy is our fixed anchor, right? Mm-hmm. That we're not going to depart from accuracy. This translation is going to start with word for word. But then this, anyone who studies another language, does translation work, knows that within the accuracy, within the value of accuracy, there is a wide spectrum of translation choices that you can make that are all accurate, but you can ensure readability. And so the translation committee had both of those values that they were working hard on. They said, we're going to be word for word wherever possible, but we're also going to ensure readability. And if there are some places where a more word for word translation could actually obscure the meaning of the original text, at those times we'll leave word for word, but we're not going to compromise accuracy.
That'd be like an Old Testament idiom that wouldn't make sense now, like an illustration,
right? A metaphor, an analogy,
yeah.
Right? Where it could actually lead the reader to think something completely different than what the original authors intended. So in a case like that, the CSB translation team would say, let's make this readable and understandable. So let's go ahead and translate the meaning of this idiom or this metaphor, and then in a footnote we'll put what this literally says, so that you can see both. But the person who is actually studying this text on their own, without a pastor or a scholar over their shoulder trying to explain this, they're going to be able to read it on their own.
Yeah, because the pastor could use the footnote to make the analogy in a sermon or when they're teaching. If they like to do that, like when I preached, I would do that. I would like to use that idiom and springboard off of it.
To explain it, right.
Yeah, but if I'm not there to explain it, right, and they're sitting at home on their couch by themselves, you're not there to tell them that. So the translation committee made sure that was clear for them if you weren't there to explain it.
Yeah, and that's really the beauty of the whole footnote apparatus and things like that. That you can do things like that, and that goes like way back even to like the King James translation would use footnotes here and there and whatnot. But that is the beauty of the CSB, is really the heart behind it is to say, we don't want to have to choose between a translation that is faithful to the original languages, accurate, literal, word for word, and that is also clear, understandable in contemporary English. And so every translation, when they were going through every verse of this Bible, the Translation Oversight Committee was asking the question, is this as accurate as it can be? And is it as readable as it can be? And both of those values together have brought the CSB into existence.
So the obvious question is, where does the CSB fit with all the other translations, right? On the spectrum that Trevin talked about, of the more word for word, the more thought for thought, where do we fall in on that? So we have a chart to help explain that just a little bit. And it kind of shows on the left side there, you see obviously the more formal word for word, that's going to be the more literal translation. On the right side, you're going to see the more dynamic, the more thought for thought, the more paraphrase types. of translations. And then you see CSB obviously kind of right there in the middle in a very convenient spot, Trevin.
Yeah, let me explain that just for a second. So you've got you see the translation continuum there on your screen. You've got the most word for word obviously is going to be more your interlinear translation, and that's not really a translation actually. It's just basically the Greek with some English words underneath it. But then on the complete other side of the spectrum, you see like the Message paraphrase by Eugene Peterson. You've got like the Living Bible, the Common English Bible. You may be wondering, okay, why are some of these translations on the bottom of this line and some of these translations are on the top of this line? The difference between these two is that those that are on the bottom of the line are those that are actually, when the translation team first came together, the translation team started by revising an existing English translation. So to put it another way, the translations on the top of the line are those that started with the original manuscripts and then consulted the English tradition. Those on the bottom of the line start with an English translation and then consult the original manuscripts, to put it that way. So now those on the top of the line also have gone through revisions since then, obviously, like the NIV 2011 is a revision of the NIV 84, but the original translation team started with the original languages. And so similar to that with the CSB, first called the HCSB when the original translation team started with the original languages and then consulted some English traditions as well. You also see on the bottom of that chart a lot of Bibles in the King James line. I like to think, if you think of Bible translations in almost as in a generational, like one of these genealogical points of view, you've got the KJV birthed the ASV, American Standard Version, which birthed the RSV, Revised Standard Version, and which now has been revised as both the ESV and the NRSV. So and they're different on the spectrum here. So you see I like to call them dueling cousins, right? Because they have different philosophical commitments in their translation theory, but they're still though they're in the King James line of the tradition. And then you have like the NLT, which started with the Living Bible, but wanted to move that more into to an actual translation, less of a paraphrase. You see that with the NLT moving more to the left, to the word for word, more to that side than the Living Bible being almost as dynamic as possible. So you take a look at that continuum though, and you see CSB is in between like an ESV and an NIV. Mm-hmm. So it's going to be more readable than the ESV, but it's also going to be more literal than the NIV.
Mm-hmm. So that kind of gives us an idea of where it fits among all the other translations, right? But isn't it a little convenient for us to have a chart put up there and we see CSB right dead in the middle, which is what we keep claiming. But actually we have another chart to show of some independent research that we got from the Global Bible Initiative, which shows that basically they were putting together a translation for the Chinese Standard Bible, so another CSB, right? And they were putting this together and they were trying to find a translation that best met that balance between accuracy and readability. And actually they sent this to us saying, hey, we're going to use the Christian Standard Bible as our base text for this. And so it kind of confirmed to us a little bit that what the translation committee tried to do, which is find that optimal balance between the two, was actually shown in our work.
Yeah, it was really encouraging and deeply affirming to our team, the original translation, and then the original translation team and the translation oversight committee to see this chart, because the Global Bible Initiative is outside of Lifeway. Mm-hmm. They were putting together a translation in Mandarin, and they wanted to model their translation philosophy off of an existing English translation. So they took the major translations, they put them through this computer algorithm in which they said, we want to find the one that has the best of both, that kind of hits the sweet spot of literal and readable. And so you look at that chart and you see how the CSB was their solution, was their answer. They contacted us and said, hey, this is the translation that best accomplishes both of those things, and we're going to be using that as the base for our philosophy. And very encouraging to the translation team, because that's optimal equivalence, right? Mm-hmm. That's exactly what they were going for. Mm-hmm. And so that's why when we put the CSB in the middle there on the translation continuum between word for word and thought for thought, we've got reasons that are external to us to be able to say that is one of the, that this translation really does accomplish that.
Yeah, and so so let's transition a little bit to, so the pastors who are watching this video. Okay, great. I love what you stand for. I love what the CSB is. I love this balance, this accuracy, readability. Let's talk a little bit more about how this can actually serve those pastors. So we know, we talked in the last video a little bit about that, feeling like you have to choose between the two. I'm going to preach from a more literal one, but I'm going to give away a more dynamic one. But the CSB, we see this balance. So give a little bit more insight into kind of the default text idea of like this just being a good text for anybody to preach and teach from.
Yeah, I would say at the very least, this translation is another solid translation that you can add to your study. When you're doing research, Bible study, sermon preparation, whenever you're working in the biblical text, you have another solid addition that you can use to consult from, because most pastors will consult multiple translations when they're doing their work. So at the very least, the CSB provides that. Some of the resources that are going to be coming along with the CSB, such as the CSV Study Bible, the Apologetic Study Bible, we have different devotional Bibles that will be coming out, other like a Worldview Study Bible and other things. All of those are going to be excellent resources as well. So at the very least, you have a good translation that you can use. But more than that, the CSB, I think it really will serve pastors and churches well, is that this is a text that is solid to preach from, also readable to share. And having a text that does both of those things well is key. Some pastors are going to wish it were more readable, or other pastors are going to wish it were more literal at times. And I would say other translations, good for those purposes. But when it comes to the text that can do the best of both of those things, which makes it a good preaching text because it's one that you can preach from and also one you can hand out to a newcomer, right. This is that text. This is one that is beautifully done. There's artistic and literary sensibility all throughout that is meant to be read in English. You read it out loud and you realize someone was reading this text with an ear to how this sounds, how this would be read. And you can tell that when you're preaching and you're reading it from the platform, but you can also tell it when you're reading it personally in your own study.
Yeah, and so us at the Christian Standard Bible, I mean, what we really hope for is that this translation will serve your church. It will help you have a translation that you can trust, a translation you know that your people can read. Because again, like we said before, our heartbeat is that we want to see more people reading the Bible. At the end of the day, that is our ultimate goal, no matter what. When we have meetings behind the scenes, when we sit down and talk about the study Bibles we're going to produce, the type of translation we have, we're always talking again and again about how is this going to serve a church? How is this going to serve a pastor? And so we pray that the CSB will do that for you.